Now, I know that one of the most, let's say, controversial characters in this series is definitely Kairi. I'm sure some of you read the title of this video and immediately thought, how could Kairi become evil? She hasn't even done anything good yet. But what if I told you that's actually why she could become evil? As one of the main characters, over the years, people have been really expecting a lot for her in terms of character development, importance to the overall narrative, and in terms of standing alongside our heroes, Sora and Riku. But for one reason or another, since Kingdom Hearts 1, she hasn't really done much of anything. In Kingdom Hearts 1, her heart spent 90% of the game inside of Sora and she was in a comatose state. The only thing she really ended up doing to help our heroes was to turn Sora back into his original form because she's a Princess of Light. In Kingdom Hearts 2, she left Destiny Islands to find Sora and Riku, but was taken by Axel and trapped in the world that never was until Sora and the gang came to rescue her. It was there that we saw her get a Keyblade, but she didn't really do much with it, at least not until recently. But this isn't another let's talk about Kairi and how they could fix her character throughout Phase 2, because frankly, I don't think it needs to be fixed. What I want to talk about today is how I think everything we've seen up until this point could be exactly what we as the audience need to be feeling when it comes to Kairi as a character. Throughout the series, it could be that Kairi always has been painted as the damsel in distress because she needed to be. Because everything that's been set up in the series until this point, from Kingdom Hearts 1 to Melody of Memory, could be something that could be paid off in future games, and possibly in a more interesting way than any of us could expect. Based on what we saw happen to Ventus and the more recent Unicross updates, I think it could be possible that the game could set up for Kairi to be a villain at some point. And I bet at this point, you're wondering how that could be possible. So, with that being said, let's dive right in. So in the Unicross update last December, we learned that the person who actually killed Lauriam's sister Strelitzia was actually Ventus, or more specifically, a being called Darkness that resided within Ventus. Now, this update confirmed a lot of things, but I want to focus on what happened with Ventus. We find out in a later update that what Ventus wanted was power. Now, the power for what or to do what, we don't know. But at the end of the day, Ventus wanted power, and Darkness knew that. And it was Darkness that gave Ventus the ability to seize that power by killing Strelitzia. And from what it looked like in that Unicross update, it looked like Darkness was controlling him while doing it. And I say that because Ventus looked pretty despondent while Darkness killed Strelitzia. And there's also the fact that Ventus literally nods and obeys Darkness during that entire sequence. Now, this in itself is interesting because Ventus is a being of pure light, as it was revealed in the most recent Unicross update. And usually when darkness possesses someone, it's because it latches onto the darkness in their heart and controls it, like what happened with Riku and Ansem in Kingdom Hearts 1. But since beings of pure light have no darkness, what exactly did it latch on to control Ventus? Well, personally, I think it could be possible that while darkness uses a being of pure light to shape itself, it has the potential to sense your emotions, or maybe if enough negative emotions accumulate over time, it could be able to feed off of those and act on your desires using you as some sort of medium. And if that is the case, I could definitely see that coming back in future games with characters like Kairi. Because over the course of the game, Kairi's been active as a story element, but as an actual force within the narrative, she leaves a lot to be desired. And over the course of the game, her wanting to be of more use to the group has been something that's been explored many times, but as we've seen, never really amounts to much of anything. But honestly, and I was thinking about this a while back and was just wondering, what if that's actually the point of Kairi's character so far? What if most of what happened throughout Phase 1 of the series was setting up for something like this to happen in Phase 2? It could be possible that while we've seen Kairi not be of much help to the group in battle and being the least experienced among her friends could be what leads to her wanting to be stronger or wanting power. And Darkness, a being that we know is attracted to beings of pure light, could give her the ability to have that power just like what happened with Ventus. And if you don't believe me, let's take a deeper look into Kairi as we've seen her in the series so far, because it's important to know where all this would be stemming from before we get to the end result. And what better place to start than from Kingdom Hearts 1. Now, in the beginning, Sora, Riku, and Kairi were set up as a trio. Sora was the cheerful one and the optimistic one, Riku was the strict and more stoic of the three, and Kairi was sort of the one in between the two of them, yet shared more characteristics with Sora. Now, at this point, we don't really know what roles the three of them are going to play in this series, but we can kind of take a few guesses since the whole trio thing is kind of common to see in media at this point. We can assume that Sora's going to be the protagonist, Riku's going to be the rival character who's going to help him out and support him, and Kairi's going to be the one to support the two of them. Right off the bat, we learn that Kairi doesn't really remember what world she came from or why she ended up on Destiny Islands, and keep that in mind because we're going to be talking about that later. Now early on, after the cutscene of the three of them talking about the outside world on the Palpu tree, we see Riku introduce the idea of the Palpu fruit as something that connects two people's destinies. We then see Riku bring it up again later during one of the challenges when he says that the winner gets to share a Palpu with Kairi. Now at this point early in the game, they're setting up Kairi to be a catalyst for some sort of romantic rivalry between Sora and Riku, which in itself doesn't foreshadow any great character development, but it is what it is. But after the island falls to darkness and Kairi's heart goes to Sora, she's effectively taken out of the game. Well, that's not entirely true. She's used as a plot element to motivate our main characters. Which, honestly, I kinda prefer that over being the romantic rival thing, but that's besides the point. When she finally wakes up near the end of the game, it's revealed that she's a Princess of Light and she's able to restore Sora from a Heartless to his original form using that power. So while she didn't do that much in Kingdom Hearts 1, what she did do had pretty significant narrative weight in that moment. If it weren't for Kairi, who knows what would have happened to Sora? That's something only she could have done. But that's not necessarily anything significant because at the end of the day, that's just because of an inherent ability, not because of something that was necessarily earned. So throughout most of the game, Kairi really just ended up playing the damsel in distress role, which for the first game in the series isn't the worst thing in the world, but it does come up with her character again when we go to future games. Things definitely changed up in Kingdom Hearts 2 for Kairi though. Kingdom Hearts 2, she gets much more screen time than she did in Kingdom Hearts 1 and Chain of Memories where she wasn't even present except for flashbacks. It's here that we see Kairi slowly but surely work up the nerve to actually go out and look for Sora and Riku, which in terms of progression is actually pretty good because we see the consequences of the first game actually change something in her character that pushes her to act differently, which is a development I can get behind, because it's the game basically telling us that Kairi does feel some form of regret for what happened and doesn't want to be sidelined, which is why she actively tries to change it by saying,
"Maybe waiting isn't good enough."
But after that development, she ultimately gets kidnapped by Axel and gets held prisoner again so Sora can come and save her. It's unfortunate because when we see Kairi actually become courageous enough to go beyond the role she had in KH1, not only does she go back to being that same damsel in distress, but in my opinion, she kinda gets outshined by her own nobody, Naminé. In Chain of Memories, Naminé was the main focus of that game, so she definitely had a spotlight on her throughout that story. We see Naminé play a similar role that Kairi did in Kingdom Hearts 1, but in a much more satisfying way since she's actually present in the narrative. And when it came to Roxas and his story in Kingdom Hearts 2, we really see Naminé act on her own accord from the beginning. We see her going against Diz to go see Roxas and even using the Corridors of Darkness to bust Kairi out of jail. And even though at the end of the game she went back to Kairi's heart as Roxas went back to Sora, it was still a satisfying conclusion to that arc because we got introduced to her character in Chain of Memories, but by the time she went back to Kairi, she's not the same person she was when we first met her. It was a satisfying character arc even though it was short-lived. But as I said earlier in Kingdom Hearts 2, we see Kairi express some form of regret for not being there for her friends, and then we see her actively venture forth from her original position as the damsel in distress, only to be pushed back into it in Kingdom Hearts 2. Kairi had tried to do the same thing that Naminé did and tried to help her friends, but unlike Naminé, couldn't accomplish her goal, which has got to be really frustrating for someone who put themselves out there and failed while watching someone in a similar situation succeed, which is actually something that does come back later. But things are different now because she's ready to get on the action now that she has a Keyblade. She's resolved to get stronger so that Sora and Riku won't have to worry about her anymore and she can stand next to the two of them and fight by their side. So things are gonna be different, right? And now we get into the more recent entries in the series. This time, Kairi is fully equipped to defend herself and is going through training to make sure she's prepared for the upcoming Keyblade War. Things were a little different in Kingdom Hearts 2 when she was just kind of given a Keyblade in the middle of the final world, but this time she's actually going to be prepared for what's coming up next, which is, again, building upon the growth we saw in Kingdom Hearts 2. She was ready to get out on the action but didn't have the means to defend herself, but now she does. That feeling of not being able to do anything in the past has essentially driven her to become someone who can actually help the people around her by training as a Keyblade wielder. And we see that progression when we get scenes like Sora and Kairi sharing the Palpu fruit when Kairi says,
"Let me keep you safe."
Since Kingdom Hearts 1, Kairi hasn't been able to do what she set out to do. She's been saved by her friends multiple times because she wasn't strong enough to get the job done. But now she actually has a chance to do what she set out to do in Kingdom Hearts 2, and that's fight alongside her friends instead of waiting for them to save her. But unfortunately, much like her other attempts to become more of an asset than a liability, that ends up not amounting to much because of her lack of battle experience. And that kinda shows when Terranort wipes out most of the Guardians of Light. And I will say though, Kairi at her best to me was seeing her go up against Xemnas. Even though it didn't necessarily change anything in the grand scheme of things, it was nice to see Kairi not only fight something other than a rogue Shadow Heartless, but one of the main antagonists of the game. And for a couple of seconds there, she actually had him on his heels for a bit. It was at this point we actually get to see Kairi hold her own against a pretty formidable opponent, and one of the first times when you think maybe she is ready for this. But unfortunately, she eventually gets kidnapped by Xemnas, and ultimately... And honestly, I could see that scene being what really drives that feeling home. Kairi finally became a full-fledged Keyblade wielder and had the ability to fight alongside the people she cares about and wants to protect. But all of that only led to her death at the hands of Xehanort. And after taking loss after loss, when we play as her in Remind, we see that it does kind of affect her. Because before you play as her, she starts off by giving herself some sort of positive affirmation when she says,
I can do this.
And again, when you're actually playing as her, one of her battle quotes was,
Please run.
and while that's pretty easy to overlook, I feel like those are two very important lines that give us a look into Kairi's emotional state at that time. Because it's at that point that we begin to see that maybe she isn't as confident as she seems. Maybe over the games, all the time she's tried to help her friends only to fail and end up being saved by them actually did end up affecting her more than she let on. And you can think that I'm overanalyzing this if you want, and normally I would agree with you if we didn't get a scene that shows us exactly that in Melody of Memory.
I want to go.
Kairi, that's not...
Yeah, I know. I want to go with you. But I know that I can't. I need to finish training. I need to become stronger. And when I do, I'll be right there next to you and Sora.
Good.
Kairi is visibly upset when Riku says she's not strong enough to join on the mission and knows that she needs to become stronger to fight next to him and Sora. And this is coming off a loss against Master Xehanort, the person who's been a major part of her life in a negative way since she was a child. All of what she's been through has been because of him, and when she comes face to face with him and had the opportunity to actually get revenge for everything he did to her, she ended up getting saved by Sora again because she couldn't get the job done. So throughout the series, we see Kairi slowly become more outgoing and express the desire to have a bigger role in the action. We see her try to step up and protect the people she cares about, but when the time comes for her to live her, for one reason or another, she's never able to. She shares a Palpy fruit with Sora, so their destinies are intertwined, but whenever he needs her, she's never able to step up. And though it may seem subtle, we do see that it ends up taking a toll on her. She becomes aware of how weak she actually is compared to her friends in Melody of Memory. She doesn't wield a Keyblade as well as Sora, and she's definitely not a master like Riku. Even Axel, who started his Keyblade training at the same time as her, had his previous combat experience to lean back on. And this is essentially another case of someone who's in a similar situation like her and Naminé were in Kingdom Hearts 2, yet ends up succeeding where she fails. And that combined with the string of losses she's had since she left Destiny Islands would definitely take a toll on anybody and leave anybody frustrated. Now, this trend kind of started with Kingdom Hearts 3, but I feel like as the story goes on, characters are becoming more emotionally aware of their situations. Like with Sora, we get to see him actually get bothered when people point out how weak he is after failing the Mark of Mastery exam. We actually get to see Sora fail at protecting his friends, and it led to one of the most emotionally charged scenes in the series to this day. More than that, we get to see Aqua actually feel the effects of spending all the time in the realm of darkness when we get a look in her heart and Remind, and I feel like this gets something that catches up with Kairi in the future as well. Because contrary to popular belief, Kairi does have character progression throughout the story. Even though she hasn't done much in terms of combat throughout the series so far, she's not the same person she was in Kingdom Hearts 1. While her development isn't as great as characters like Aqua or Riku, I definitely say it's there. And as she goes forward to train with Aqua to hopefully aid in the mission to find Sora, it's clear that she knows she needs one thing: power. the power to protect Sora and Riku as they travel into an unknown reality and face unknown enemies, the power to protect herself and her friends against other enemies that may show up in the future. And since the being known as darkness needs beings of light to form themselves, it could be possible that the same thing that happened to Ventus in Unicross could happen to Kairi in the future. It could latch onto her emotions and feel all of the frustration and anger and other negative emotions that could stem from Kairi being unable to protect her friends, and possibly use that to give her the power, and you can't see it but I'm using air quotes when I say that, to protect them. But in reality, it could end up being some sort of power that she can't control that ends up putting her friends in danger. And it doesn't seem like there's sort of a rhyme or reason as to how or why darkness could control people, especially beings of pure light nonetheless, but we do know that it's possible. And we do know that there is at least one darkness in the current timeline, and there could very easily be more than that in the current timeline. And while we know that there's one there could very easily be more. And in that same breath, there could very easily be one inside of Kairi that could show up later in the series, possibly for the same reason that it showed up in the case of Ventus. But I do think that everything Kairi has been through throughout the course of Phase 1 could be leading to something like this in the future of Phase 2. And I made a video similar to this a while ago, but I do think we could end up seeing some more character moments like we got in KH3 in future titles. And while we could see scenes like that with other characters as well, I think Kairi's negative emotions that have been growing over the course of the games, being the medium for darkness to latch onto, could be an interesting way to not only make use of her story so far, but also to tie into the future of the series. Call me crazy, but I do think this is something that could definitely show up in the future of the series as we go into Phase 2. So this was definitely a longer video, but I do want to start making longer, more in-depth videos, so let me know if you guys like these. But that's going to be all from me today, and if you liked it, leave a like for your boy and consider subscribing if you haven't already. With that being said, this is Moose Wayne, signing off.